Time to get started. Welcome everybody to our Bible study. I'll just go over the sick basically now. Hibernia Shepherd is in Mercy Health Room 826, and she's improving quite a bit, and we're so thankful for that. Ruth Ann had tests, had a scope run down her esophagus to see if there was a irritation down there, and that there was a little bit, but nothing serious. Josephine Clark is recovering from surgery, from open heart surgery, and Bonita had tests last Friday, and the results don't have them yet. Okay, we'll be praying for that. Good results on that. Anybody else sick this morning?
Mark, a lot of people have asked about the Higgins woman, and Carmela said the other day that she had some broken bones, but she was healed.
Yeah, Wanda Higgins. Okay, so good. Okay, any more sick? Okay, thank you.
Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. Thank you for being here in our Bible study, and we'll continue with our study of the Epistle of James. And I invite you to turn to chapter 3. As you see on the screen, a fitting subtitle for James' letter would be this question: what is a Christian to do? And in many different respects, James addresses that question. And we could even simply put it like this: well, what James does throughout his book is emphasize how a Christian should live. And he begins in the first chapter, and then as we study through the second, now into the third, we see in many ways how he stresses that. How we live as a Christian is important. So in these different ways, he stresses Christian living. We should value faith. That should be even seen in how we respond to challenges, right? To trials. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into manifold trials. Well, that's a very unexpected and certainly not a matter embraced by the world. Why would we do that? Well, it makes us stronger. It makes us stronger in what way? Our faith. And our faith is what is involved in helping us save our souls, helping us stay faithful to the very end. So value faith to that extent. Pray for wisdom because we need God's help. Maintain perspective. Remember, he said whether you're rich or poor, you have unique challenges to maintain spiritual perspective. And obey the word. Don't be just a what? Don't be just a hearer of the word. Be a doer. And then he emphasized how if we hold the faith of the Lord Jesus Christ, don't show respect of persons. We need to be fair. We need to be compassionate in reality, not just in word. And so live, we might say, live like you believe. And now we're thinking about his extended teaching in chapter 3 on speech. As we surveyed the first part of this chapter last week, we said we could approach it with these probing questions to emphasize the different aspects of his teaching. How significant is speech? Well, he begins, don't be in a rush to be up in front. Well, why not? Knowing teachers will receive a more strict judgment. And that's just a warning and an example of how important speech is, not only in everyday life, but especially when presenting spiritual instruction. That's an even higher level of responsibility. How powerful is speech? Well, like he has done often, he draws on things that are very familiar to us, things from everyday life, in order to make a point. Well, you have the bit that's put in a horse's mouth. You have the rudder that steers the ship. You have a spark that starts a forest fire. And in every one of these examples, James is just reaffirming something very small can create big results. And those aren't always good results, but nevertheless, big things can come. That's how powerful speech is. And we made just a quick, extremely quick observation of the book of Proverbs last week to say how much both positive and negative is addressed in those Proverbs about speech. It's a very powerful thing. And in fact, James says the difficulty of controlling it is something we could all relate to. And in fact, then he says, the reality is you can set your whole life on fire by improper speech. And so, in the section we were addressing at the end of our class, verses 9 through 12, the question could be asked, well, what does uncontrolled speech reveal? Again, he draws from nature. He uses the example of a spring, a freshwater spring, which something that ancient people of James' day living in Palestine could well appreciate. So if they were traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho or whatever it might have been, people know where the water sources are for their trip. And you think about people in those ancient times traveling to Jerusalem for the Passover, traveling in different ways for pleasure or for business or whatever it might have been. People were more in tune with natural water sources in a day and time which they relied upon those on an everyday basis. And so they would know, well, in this area there's a natural spring. We can fill our water jugs, or we could fill our leather canteens, our leather flasks. We could do that there. And what kind of experience would it be if they went and one time it's sweet and one time it is bitter? Brackish water, just polluted water, or salty. James says the natural world itself is consistent. If it's a freshwater spring, it's going to give you fresh water. He ends by maybe an unexpected example from our standpoint, but he turns it over and says if you have a salt spring or a salt water source, do you expect it to produce fresh water? Well, no. Think about that area around the Dead Sea. What was another name for the Dead Seas? Anybody remember? Right. The Great Salt Sea. And there would be areas in which pools of water might be found in that region, and because of the consistency of the soil and all of that, there were many sources of water that were just not fit to drink. Now, amidst this observation of a source like a spring producing a certain kind of water, James says within that, now, here's the case with people. Verse 9, with the same mouth they'll bless God. Oh, blessings for God, blessings for God. And turn around and curse one made in God's image. Now, the spring can't help it. If it's salty, it's salty. If it's fresh, it's fresh. But people can help it. And that's why he says these things ought not to be. That is an inconsistency. If that be the case, if we are claiming to be a Christian, claiming to be changed by Jesus, then if we're truly changed on the inside, what should bubble up on the outside? What is consistent with the Christian faith? And so what does uncontrolled speech reveal? It reveals there's a problem on the inside, which is what Jesus says, and that's why the verse Matthew 12:34 is here for. Because Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so it's very important then to think about, James says, how Christianity, or how the Christian life, should fill our entire being, to the point that we, going back to chapter 1, verse 26, bridle the tongue. And so we can appreciate that, and James says there's not a single person that can't relate to that. Now, let's go into verses 13 to 18 for a minute. How to show wisdom. Wisdom is something that James has brought up already. In fact, he said if someone lacks wisdom, what should he do? Ask God. So we'll again talk about what wisdom is, the importance of it to the Christian, and the need to ask God for assistance regarding wisdom. But here he drills down on how to show wisdom. And in case you want a hint, I've given you a hint. It's not by saying, I'm wise. So, claims or beliefs or thoughts withstanding, wisdom is something that is shown by actions, by how we engage, how we respond, how we think, how we express concern, what really deep down motivates us. These are things that James invites us to think about. So let's reflect upon this for just a minute. This topic of wisdom now, and how it relates to speech. I'm going to begin by reading here the text. We don't have too many verses at this point covering this section. So I'll read James 3:13 to 18, and we'll think about how it applies to us. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by his good life his works in meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and faction in your heart, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom is not a wisdom that cometh down from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where jealousy and faction are, there is confusion and every vile deed. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without variance, without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for them that make peace. you can see as James begins to turn his attention to this matter of wisdom, he begins this section with a question. And it kind of raises not a completely new point, but a different aspect of it. Here's what I mean. He says back in chapter 1 and verse 26, if anyone thinks that he's religious, he says at the beginning of this chapter, not in a question, but implicit, do you think you're prepared to be a teacher? And here, similarly, who's wise? Step forward. So the matter that he has raised several times, and I've highlighted these two previous ones that correspond to this one. The matter that he has raised several times is how we think about ourselves. And the question of being careful not to overestimate ourselves. Correspondingly, think about another point that has been introduced here and there as he covers different topics. Receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your soul. And here again, he's going to talk about who's wise. Let him show it by his life in meekness of wisdom. These are two sides of the same coin. James says, we need as Christians to be humble people. That makes us willing to hear God's word. It makes us able to do real self-analysis. It gives us really the capacity to grow and to live out our Christian life. But the person who doesn't have any room for improvement, and then you hear the kinds of words they say, the kinds of interactions they have, it makes us wonder how deep this religion really goes. So this is a very consistent theme, dealt with kind of in a positive standpoint or in a negative standpoint, inviting us to do what? Look into our own hearts and say, am I living out my faith? Am I living like Jesus wants me to live? And I think it is important, no matter what New Testament letter we're reading, every time we have encouragement and teaching and instruction and warnings, we should not take it as a condemnation. James is not saying all you people are worthless. All you people are full of pride. He understands that at any congregation there's a mix of folks, people who've been Christians for a long time, folks that have been Christians for a very short time. There are people that are struggling with a lot of challenges. There are others not so much. There are people who are maybe having an issue with pride and others who might be very meek and humble. There's a mix. So every time he gives an admonition, it's not an accusation, but it's a reminder, as we need daily reminders, to think about what Jesus calls us to be. He doesn't call us to be people who hold to a set of doctrinal ideas. He calls us to be people who live out our faith. So, this is the nature of the question. As we work through this section, you can see it is very simply going to develop along the lines of this transition, this question that sets up everything else, and then from there we go to an analysis of what he calls wisdom that's not from above and wisdom that is from above. And we keep in mind he's talking to Christians. So it's easy to slide in our minds to the idea, well, he starts talking about wisdom that's not from above and it's demonic. Well, he's talking about folks out in the world, and then the wisdom that's from above is what Christians. He's not looking at it like that. He's just saying as individuals, all of us being Christians, as individuals, we need to analyze the skill set that we bring to life, to living, to engaging with one another. We need to analyze the tools we use in social interaction. Are these tools that we use in social interaction really designed for selfish ends, or are we thinking about other people's souls? That's the opportunity James gives us to think about our Christian lives. So here's one way to express it. Who claims to be wise and understanding among you? James is not asking for information. He is inviting us to do self-analysis. Who is wise? Who says he's religious? Who wants to step forward and say, I'm wise and have understanding? Now, think about these words, and they'll help us in our study of this section. These words that have very specific connotations. Who is wise? Wisdom in this sense, just like earlier in chapter 1, is the idea of skill. The words in Old Testament times were used in very everyday senses. A person was wise or had a certain skill set, like those people who made the priestly garments. They did all of that, I don't know if you would say embroidery work. They did all of that beautiful work, the colors and the threads and the stones. They had a certain wisdom. They could take the raw material and they could then put it to use. Think about this analogy. Let's suppose someone is building a home, and all the building material is delivered. Everything needed to begin the house and to complete the house, all the building material has been delivered. Now, you could call me, or you could get a hold of a contractor. The outcome is going to be very different. You see, there's more to getting the house completed than just having the material. It's the contractor or someone with building experience who can take the material and then make a house out of it. It's not just having the material, because as everyone knows, you're going to run into problems. And the builder knows, how do I adjust with problems? How do I deal with this drainage issue? How do I deal with this being level or not level? How do I deal with this material that doesn't quite fit? What's the proper tool? What's the proper order? It's his wisdom that takes the material and makes out of it a home. That's the essence of the word. But now we're not talking about building houses or making priestly garments. We're talking about making a life. How do I make a Christian life? Here's the raw material. Here's the teaching of Jesus. Here's the New Testament. Here's the Old Testament principles. Here's all the building material. How do I put that into practice tomorrow? When I am living my life and face various challenges, engage with difficult people, or wrestle with my own weaknesses. How do I take the building material and then use it. That's what James is talking about. The word understanding here is really a synonym for wisdom, but stresses the idea of someone who has this knowledge. And here we're talking about living the Christian life. And what is essential to all of this is humility. There will be a certain mindset that is ready to step forward and say, me, James, you look up wisdom in the dictionary, you see my picture. You have any questions, any concerns, any aspects of church work or opinion or whatever, I'm your man. Not so fast. If you want to demonstrate that you're able to take the raw material of Christian teaching and actually put it into practice in a life that pleases God, prove it, is James' recommendation. Show it by your life, not by boastful claims. You notice how he then makes the statement. Who claims to be wise and an expert among you? Let him show by the way he lives, by his conduct. Let him show what? His works in a meek way that is wise, in an unpretentious way. Meekness here, related to the idea of humility, involves in a controlled way, in a restrained way. He would say, I'll let my kindness do the talking. I'll let my benevolence do the talking. I'll let my consistency do the talking. That's James' teaching. Now, just a point on translation in passing. If you're reading from the King James, you'll see this word, conversation. By your conversation, let your works be shown. You'll find this about 20 times in the King James Version, and some of these uses of the word conversation fall off with other versions. So you'll have words like conduct or life. And the reason for that is the word conversation was a much broader term a couple hundred years ago. James is talking more about talking to each other. He's talking about our whole life. And so it was a perfect word when it was used, but there's probably in 2024 a more fitting word, because conversation today means talking to each other. And in all the uses of this word, you can see translators today opting for something like conduct or in your life, all of your life. And that's the meaning of the original term. But one thing is clear, James says, let's show. Let's show that we know how to apply the teachings of Jesus by the lives that we live. So he's going to look a little more closely at this idea of wisdom. Wisdom as a skill set for living. He says, but if you have bitter zeal and selfish ambition in your heart, and what's the underlying kind of thought? Regardless of what you claim, if actually in your heart you have bitter zeal and selfish ambition, don't brag about that. Don't boast about how spiritual you are if this is in your heart. In effect, what you're doing is lying against the truth. The The truth says we ought to be one thing on the inside and on the outside. Another mindset says, well, I can think it as long as I don't say it. Well, if you think it, eventually, well, that's a problem too. So anyway, James is making this observation about a certain negative mindset wherein Christianity hasn't gotten deep enough to transform the way we feel and think. So he's asking us to think about this. You'll often see in verse 14 the translation bitter jealousy or bitter envy. And those are perfectly fitting terms. The word here is zelos, which sounds like zeal. Now, I don't think on a normal basis I would render this verse with the word zeal, because zeal has more of a positive connotation. But I just wanted to put it here to remind us that that is the underlying word. And the word is used in the New Testament in positive and negative ways. And the point is, you could be on fire for something, but on fire for the wrong thing. You could have a religious zeal like the Pharisees, who would deny that they were not zealous folks. But it's the wrong kind of zeal. And that's why normally you'll see it translated jealousy, kind of a fervor or zeal that's out of place. So combined with this word selfish ambition or selfishness, James gives us this idea. As you look into your heart and you think about your deepest motives, are they Christ-like? And he then says, this wisdom, why did I put it in quotes? Not really wisdom. Someone claims it is. They might think, I am so clever. I have such a quick wit. I don't mind saying what needs to be said. And on it goes. I have this uncanny skill set to use my mouth in a certain way. James says, don't we got to look into the heart? Wisdom is not being clever, quick-witted, or being able to win an argument. Wisdom, according to the teaching of Jesus, is something that comes from deep within. The skill set for living like Jesus is not a sharp tongue. The skill set for living like Jesus is exhibiting restraint and concern rather than selfish ambition, getting my way. And so James says this kind of, quote, wisdom, I mean, someone sees it as an attribute. This kind of wisdom is not from above, but is worldly, unspiritual, and demonic. James, what do you really think about that? It's, as some translations will put it, earthy. It's not heavenly, it's earthy, or worldly. It is sensual, the King James says, which means just having to do with nothing but the flesh. If you could, hypothetically, if you could take a human being and take his soul out of him, take all morality out of him, take his conscience out of him, and just have him a living thing, that's that word. Just the flesh. This kind of engagement with our community, whatever it is, or our family, this kind of, quote, wisdom is not pleasing to God. He says then, for where this kind of jealousy is, where this kind of competitive spirit is, and selfish ambition, there is rebellion and every low-down deed. How does your translation put the end of verse 16? I'm sorry, verse 16. The end of verse 16. Every evil thing, every vile deed. What's that, Sherry? Confusion and every evil work, evil practice. So James is saying, here's the result. Where there is selfishness and jealousy, you know what the end result of that is? It's not a community where there is peace and harmony. There ends up being confusion or rebellion, lawlessness, and every vile deed. The word translated vile or evil is a word that means, the Bauer, Art, and Gingrich and Danker lexicon translates this word as base. What does that mean? If something is base, morally base. Low down. It's morally bankrupt. The product of selfishness, however it's hidden, creates a community wherever it's allowed to exist where there are problems. Every imaginable problem results from this kind of selfishness. But on the other hand, he says there is a certain skill set that comes from above. It's learned, and it is one that we embrace. It is one that God helps us with. If any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all liberally and upbraideth not, and to him it will be given. This wisdom is from above. The wisdom that is from above is, first of all, pure, then peace-loving, willing to listen, etc., etc. Look at how he begins to construct this list. He says, first of all, it's this, and let me tell you then what results from that. All of the things at the end of the list after pure have to do with how we engage other people. All of it has to do with social interaction. But it's first what? Pure. That all the motives are right, all the thinking is right. Someone says, I really want to please the Lord. That's the basis of how he makes decisions and how he interacts with other people. I am bound by Jesus as to how I treat my fellow man. Well, they don't deserve it, or they got what was coming to them. This wisdom that's from above is first pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Has Christianity, has the teaching of Jesus really permeated our hearts? That's what James says is first and foremost. That's foundational. It's first pure. It's unmixed. We've worked at the issue of selfish ambition, and we've turned our life over to the Lord. We're seeking the things that are above. And then the effect of that is peace-loving. We know that the environment where peace is created is an environment where people can flourish. They feel safe. They can share their concerns and grow. Willing to listen or easy to be entreated. This is an interesting word that carries the idea of being able to be persuaded very easily. And we might think, well, as a Christian, I shouldn't be a person who can be just easily persuaded. I have my convictions. He's not talking here about doctrinal matters. He's talking about someone who knows how to pick their battles. Every single conflict, every single disagreement is not worth drawing swords over. I'm willing to give in on so many things, the wise Christian would say, because I want to create an environment of peace in my family, in my community, wherever it might be. I want to be that person who fulfills the teaching of Jesus. Blessed are the peacemakers. They shall be called sons of God. So this is the effect of pure wisdom, wisdom from above in the heart. Willing to listen, full of compassion, good fruit, impartial, not hypocritical. These are the traits that can be shown and seen in the lives that we lead. So righteousness, that is all of these things. Doing what's right, interacting in a Christ-like way. Righteousness is the fruit of what is planted in peace for those who've been cultivating peace. If you're trying to live a life that is pleasing to God, the fruit of that is righteousness. Now that's the kind of skill all of us need to work on, and it's not a one and done thing, right? It's a process, and we keep making effort. And one thing that James' letter certainly does, it calls us all to do introspection like we're supposed to do every Lord's Day. And say, am I living out my faith? God help us to do that, and He will. And we can encourage each other to that end as we want to live as Christ wants us to live. Thank you for being in our Bible study this morning.